Hi everyone, welcome back to the second part of this week's lecture. So in the first part, we talked about sentencing and punishment. This section, we're going to look specifically at the death penalty, so one specific form of punishment. We will talk a little bit more about different forms of punishment in future chapters, but this week, this section, we're only going to focus on the death penalty. Excuse me. So let's get started. Okay, so we are going to start talking about the death penalty. So the first thing that I want to point out is that when you're talking about the death penalty, it is often referred to as capital punishment. So if you see anything that says capital punishment, that's what they're talking about. They're actually talking about the death penalty. So those terms are interchangeable with each other. So this is just a quote, "Kill one, frighten 1,000." So we talked about the different goals of punishment and what punishment is trying to achieve. When you read this quote, what goal of punishment do you think it is saying? Right? So if you kill one, frighten 1,000, which one of those of the goals that we went over does that describe? Well, it describes deterrence, right? Because you're trying to scare other people into not committing the crime, and specifically general deterrence. So, but what other goals do you think the death penalty tries to achieve? So definitely deterrence. Like if you see somebody getting the death penalty, maybe you won't commit that crime because you don't want to get the death penalty. But are there other goals that are listed on there? Maybe retribution, an eye for an eye. Because you took somebody's life, we're going to take yours. Maybe incapacitation. Isn't it the ultimate incapacitation? Because you are taking their life so they could never commit another crime. So there are multiple goals that people allege are being met with the death penalty. And those are some of the reasons why people advocate for it. Now, I already said this when I started. So capital punishment, capital offense equals the death penalty. Okay, so if you commit a capital offense, that is an offense that is eligible for capital punishment, which is the death penalty. So these things are all used interchangeably. Now, just some basic information about the death penalty so that you have some basic numbers and understanding what we're talking about. So when we're talking, excuse me. So when we're talking about executions in the United States, you can see the different numbers of executions that have occurred. So this only goes to 2015, but you can see the peak of executions was in the year 1999, and they've slowly started to decline. The other part to notice is down here we had 0. So we're going to talk about that later and why that happened during that time period. But you see, as a society, we are using the death penalty less and less all the time. Now, what are some of the methods that have been used for the death penalty? Obviously, in really olden times, they used some of those horrific sort of physical punishments, drawing and quartering and all of those kind of things were very bad forms of punishment. But the more modern types of execution is what we're going to talk about. So you used to have death by hanging. So death by hanging was a form of capital punishment. We also had firing squad. So firing squad is still actually hanging, and firing squad are still on the books in certain states. Death by gassing. So the gas chamber was used. In my lifetime, the gas chamber was used. So they would put people in a room and then use gas to kill them. And it like sort of goes back to what was used in Germany during concentration camps and World War II. There's no place that uses gas chambers anymore. Death by execution. So they would use the electric chair. So they would set you in the chair and connect you to electricity. And then they would turn the electricity up high and it would electrocute the person. So that was a form of execution. And then we have death by lethal injection. So right now, death by lethal injection is the main form of death penalty that's used in this country. Now, it's been controversial in recent years. The medicines that are being used are very difficult to get because the companies that produce them don't want those drugs to be used for the death penalty, so they refuse to sell them to states for the use in executions. So they've tried different drugs, and there's been a lot of botched lethal injections recently because of the combinations of drugs that they're using. So there is a question of whether or not this is going to be challenged in the future, whether we're going to keep using lethal injection. So there has been some pushback for firing squad again. There's been some pushback for other forms of the death penalty being used, electric chair and things like that. So it'll be interesting to see where this goes in our future. So you can see when you look at the chart, these are different methods of execution that are used in different states. So if it's the light, it's a state that has no death penalty at all. The green, the sort of light, the more of a green color, those are all lethal injection. So you can see that there are multiple states that most states use lethal injection. Red, Nebraska, they still use the electric chair. I said none did, but obviously it's still in the books in Nebraska. I don't think they've used it though in recent years. And then in the yellow, they allow people to choose. So there may be, so lethal injection would be one choice, and then some are hanging, some are firing squad, some are electric chair. So they would possibly give the person a choice to do it, okay? Oh, actually, it says California still uses gas. So I guess I was wrong. I apologize. Washington State has hanging. So you can see some of these still occur throughout the country. But lethal injection is the main one that we use. So what are some of the stats? So just the numbers. When we're looking at lethal injection, what do the numbers tell us? Well, when you look at the whole world, you can see who still uses the death penalty for ordinary crimes. We're the only Western world country that still uses it. So you can see like pretty much none of South America, just a small snippet here. This is all the United States. It's Alaska and then United States, and then the Middle East and some parts of Africa. But very few places in the world still use the death penalty. And a lot of the Western world has absolutely completely abolished it. So there's been a lot of push from international circles to abolish it in the United States too. People think that we should not be using the death penalty. We have what's called the International Declaration of Human Rights. These are human rights that everybody in the world should have, the UN has come up with. And they say you should not have the death penalty. And we do not sign off on the Universal Declaration of Human Rights because of that provision, because we still have the death penalty. Oops, sorry about that. I didn't mean to do that. Okay. Why does this keep doing this to me? Okay, try again. Now, these are the different states. So states with and without the death penalty. So you can see the light blue has no death penalty at all. So you're mostly talking about the northeast and central north part of our country. But as you can see, most of the South still has the death penalty. Now, there's a couple places that have what we call a moratorium. What has happened is that they have it on the books, but the governors have stopped using it. And most of the time, this is because there have been cases where people have been either wrongfully executed. So after they were executed, they found out that the person didn't really commit the crime, or there were other issues that happened with the death penalty. So a lot of places have placed moratoriums on the death penalty. So even though they're in the books, they don't actually use the death penalty. So what region of the country is it most used? Obviously, you can see from the chart that the South is going to be where it's used the most. We still use it quite a bit out west, but the North is going to be the least because most states don't even have it in the North. And then when we look at states, what states use it the most frequently, you can see that, okay? So other means they're lumping them all together. but Texas is by far the state that uses the most. Now, since we have this background information, now we need to look at some of the legal issues that are involved with the death penalty. When you're talking about the death penalty, you're mostly talking about what we call Eighth Amendment challenges. So remember, hopefully you remember when we talked about different amendments, that the Eighth Amendment is the amendment against cruel and unusual punishment. So when we're talking about death penalty, we're talking about whether or not we believe that the death penalty is cruel and unusual punishment. The other thing that comes up a lot of times with legal challenges are what we call due process challenges, where we think the process is unfair and therefore somebody should not be eligible for the death penalty. So what are some of these legal issues? Well, the first time that the Supreme Court ever had to even decide whether or not they thought the death penalty was constitutional was in 1890. So it was quite a while ago. And this was the first time it went to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court said, we're only going to outlaw the methods of execution that are what we call cruel and unusual, or torture or lingering death methods. So if you're using a form of the death penalty that is torturous and causes extensive pain, or lingering death, so the person is suffering for extreme periods of time, that is going to be declared as unconstitutional. So a lot of those early forms of punishment, drawing and quartering and castration and all of those other things, tarring and feathering, all of those have been declared unconstitutional as cruel and unusual because they cause torture or lingering death. But the Supreme Court did not outlaw it all the way. They didn't say you couldn't do it. They just said, if you're using a method that's torturous or causes lingering death. So this will be interesting with the more recent cases of lethal injection. There's been several different states that have used different drugs, and the people have suffered extensive pain and did not die for hours after giving the lethal injection. And that can be problematic. Same thing has happened with the electric chair. It did not cause instant death. So you're going to see probably at some point in your life different challenges to some of these methods as cruel and unusual. Now, remember that time period where we showed you the chart and it said there was 0 or only 1 or 2 for many, many years? That was because of a series of court cases. In 1972, the Supreme Court again faced the issue of the death penalty and whether or not it was constitutional. And in Furman versus Georgia, the Supreme Court said, at the way it's being used right now, and because we are evolving, we have an evolving standard of decency, and we don't think as a society the way it's being used now is decent, then and we're becoming more civilized, and we don't believe in that, they invalidated the death penalty. So in 1972, it was declared unconstitutional. So it was unconstitutional to sentence somebody to death. So that is why you had those years without any death penalty being implemented. After that happened, Georgia wanted to still have it. So their legislature went back and tried to revise what they had. And they read Furman as saying, it's just the way you're using it right now and the way you're setting up the process or fair process to give somebody the death penalty. So Georgia rewrote how somebody can receive the death penalty. And they created what's called a two-step trial process, or sometimes you'll hear people refer to it as a bifurcated trial. And what this means is there's one whole part of the trial that's just determining if the person is guilty or not, to convict or acquit. If they find guilty and they convict, then you're going to set up a whole new sentencing hearing, which we talked about. And during that sentencing hearing, the only issue the jury is going to decide is whether or not the person is going to receive the death penalty. So two separate things, same jury, but first you're just determining guilt. Then second, you're trying to determine if the person should receive the death penalty. Now, when the jury's evaluating whether or not the person should receive the death penalty, they are required under this decision, this Gregg versus Georgia decision, to weigh aggravating and mitigating factors. So in the last lecture, we talked about aggravating factors make you mad, make you want to give the death penalty. Mitigating factors are things that you're going to make you feel bad and not want to give the death penalty. So this was the procedure that Georgia set in place, and it went all the way back into the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court said, okay, we think this is fair process. So they reinstated the ability to have the death penalty. After this case, though, all death penalties have to be done this way. So if your state is going to give somebody the death penalty, they have to have a bifurcated trial. And that jury has to weigh aggravating and mitigating circumstances. So they actually, as a jury, have to list everything that they have agreed as everyone on the jury, what the aggravating factors are. They have to all agree on what is the mitigating factors. And when they make their list, then they have to see which list is higher or lower. If it's higher, they have to go with the death penalty, or they can go with the death penalty. If it's lower, they cannot. They cannot give the death penalty if mitigating factors outweigh aggravating factors. So this is basically the process that is now used when people face the possible death penalty for a punishment. So then we had to consider, can you give the death penalty for rape? So traditionally, the death penalty was saved for like killing somebody, right? So retribution, an eye for an eye, you kill somebody, we're going to kill you. And then some states tried to expand this and require or grant or give the death penalty for less severe crimes than homicide. So it came up as a case, can you give it for rape? And this came up in Coker versus Georgia. And the Supreme Court said, no, it is not a valid punishment for rape. It is too harsh. So one of the things we talked about with sentencing was proportionality. The punishment has to fit the crime. And what the Supreme Court said is, really, we're going to try to reserve the death penalty for the worst of the worst of the worst. It's the harshest, worst punishment because we're taking somebody's life. So we're only going to use it for the worst or harshest crimes. And rape, even though it's a horrible crime, does not take somebody's life. They're still alive. And so therefore, we're not going to allow the death penalty. So that existed. After that, there was another case that came up, and it was about a rape of a child. So a child was at home, and she was going to the bus stop, and then she came home. According to her father, she came home, and she was all bloody, and she was attacked, and she was raped. Well, when they took her to the hospital, she had severe internal damage. And so the police became involved and started investigating. When they went to the house, it became very evident that she was raped by the father, stepfather. And so then it became an issue. Well, that's worse than regular rape, because now you're talking about a rape of a child. Can we give the death penalty for the rape of a child? And the Supreme Court still said no. Supreme Court said, again, that the death penalty has to be reserved for the worst of the worst of the worst. Now, some of you may be thinking raping a child is the worst of the worst of the worst. And I can't really disagree with you on that. But what I can say is the unfortunate way it's going to be, the child is probably going to be traumatized for life, but the child's still alive. And the Supreme Court said, therefore, it's not a proportionate punishment for that, even though it's a horrendous crime. Okay, so what I want you to do now is think about, what about other cases giving the death penalty? What do you think about these cases? So I want you to think about this scenario. A heinous murder occurred in a small town. The entire family, mother, father, 8-year-old and 3-year-old son, were brutally killed. After a full investigation, the accused was arrested and is now standing trial. You must decide whether or not to seek the death penalty. Okay, so that's your scenario. Now, I want you to think through each of these possible defendants. What if the defendant was a male who was mentally insane? So meets the insanity test, does not know right from wrong, complete severe schizophrenia, break from reality, meets the severe level of insanity. Should that defendant still face the death penalty? What about if they suffer severe intellectual disability, meaning their IQ is really low? Now, I know this is not politically correct and people don't use this terminology, but the court cases still cite this. So this is what you'll see. They use a test to determine whether the person fits the definition of mental retardation. And that's all based on IQ. Okay, so they give an IQ test to the person and see if they test as a severe intellectual disability. If they do, then should they be able to receive the death penalty? What about somebody that's only 17 years old? What about, does it make a difference if it's a male or female that's 17 years old? What if it's a 12-year-old? Does it make a difference if it's male or female? And then what about an accomplice to a murder who didn't actually commit the crime? So they may have helped the person, but they were not the one that actually pulled the trigger or did the killing. Do you think they should be eligible for the death penalty? So think through them each, really give them some thought. What do you think? What are your thoughts on executing any one of these categories? Now, when you look at what the courts have said, they have created rules for different things. So the first one is, can you execute someone who is deemed mentally insane? So again, this is somebody that meets the insanity test, like severe schizophrenia type of thing. Is it going to be okay to execute somebody that has mental insanity? The Supreme Court has said no. It is unconstitutional to execute somebody that is suffering from a severe mental illness. Their brain's not right. It doesn't think right. So we cannot give them the ultimate punishment. There's no intent. They didn't even really understand what they were doing. So no death penalty. Now, what about the one that has the severe intellectual disability, the super low IQ? What about them? Can you give them the death penalty? Supreme Court has said no. Okay. So Atkins versus Virginia was the first Supreme Court case to hear the case. And what the Supreme Court said, that executing a person with intellectual disabilities is unconstitutional. So you cannot execute people if they have suffered from intellectual disability. Now, we said this is usually determined by IQ. Okay, so we have to figure out what's the level of IQ that qualifies as intellectually disabled. And this came up in 2014, and they said that if you have a death row inmate whose IQ is around or close or below 70 IQ standard, then that qualifies as intellectual disability and they cannot be executed. So they kind of at least gave a number for determining this. And the tests used to determine IQ have been challenged, and which test, use a more recent test, an old test. And the Supreme Court has basically said you have to use the more modern forms of a determining intellectual disability. So that's where we currently stand for that factor. Now, what about age? So we talked about 17, and then we talked about 12. Okay, we talked about the difference between males and females. Do you think either one of them should be executed? So there was a series of court cases that went to the Supreme Court trying to settle on what age should you be eligible to receive the death penalty. And finally, in 2005, the Supreme Court settled on 18 years of age. So it goes by the time the day you commit the crime. So if you commit a heinous crime when you're 17 years and 11 months and 12 days, you're not quite 18 yet, you are not eligible to receive the death penalty. But once you turn 18, then you are eligible to receive the death penalty. So that's the age that the Supreme Court has finally settled on. So I want you to lastly start thinking about what are some of the arguments that you know that have been set forth for and against the death penalty, right? So think about, why do some people think the death penalty is good? Why would you think that maybe we shouldn't have the death penalty anymore? So see if you can jot down any ideas that are arguments for or against the death penalty. So once you're done with that, you can start the video again and we'll go over some of the main arguments. So opposition to the death penalty. So these are people that oppose the death penalty and do not believe we should have the death penalty any longer. One of the arguments for the death penalty, for against the death penalty, is often that it's not effective deterrent. So remember we said hang one, scare 1,000. There has been a lot of research that shows this doesn't really work, because when people are going to kill somebody, they don't often stop and think, wait, if I kill them, then I will get the death penalty, so I don't want to do that. And it hasn't really worked out that way. So it seems like it would work, but in reality, it hasn't really been a deterrent to people committing homicides. Other people argue that it's often given arbitrarily. So you live in a certain state, certain ideas, you may have a much greater chance of getting the death penalty than other places. And that makes it kind of arbitrary. It's not really a set standard that applies equally to everybody in the country. Other people say that it reduces society to the level of the criminal, right? So we say, don't kill, don't kill, don't kill. Killing's bad. And then we turn around and we kill people for it. So it's inconsistent. And many people argue it's hypocritical to kill somebody when we're trying to teach people not to kill. Another large argument that you often see is that the death penalty is racist and given more likely to people minority status. Another side argument of that is that it targets the poor. So they have done a lot of research and they have shown that it's not necessarily that more Black or minority people receive the death penalty. That hasn't actually been historically correct. But what it does show is if you are Black and you kill somebody that's white, your chances of get the death penalty substantially increase, okay? So there's similar numbers of Blacks and whites on death row and other minorities, but if you are Black or a minority and you kill a white person, your chances are going to go significantly higher. So this issue of it being discriminatory against African Americans, Blacks, minorities, went to the Supreme Court. And when the Supreme Court looked at all of the data, they said, yeah, we don't really see that. We do not think it's discriminatory. So as of right now, that is not a great legal argument for the Supreme Court. They're not going to say that it is racist and outlawed based on that. In more recent years, there's been a lot more challenges that it targets the poor. So very rarely do you see super wealthy people even get the death penalty or be executed. And I mean, that's probably consistent with even super wealthy people being convicted of crimes. Now, sometimes they are, but they are even less likely to receive the death penalty. And a lot of that may be based on that they have the resources to hire attorneys to help them get out of death penalty more than people that are poor. So you really see this discrepancy of who gets death penalty more along the lines of socioeconomic status and not quite as much as racist, okay? But the Supreme Court right now has said it's not racist. They haven't really talked about the poor issue yet. And then another argument against it is the use of the death penalty is super expensive. Because if somebody is get put on death row, the type and amount of security that exists for people on death row is substantially higher. The cost of that is substantially higher than housing regular inmates in the regular cells. So what has happened is you have to, excuse me, be in your own cell. You have a higher, you have a lower number of inmates per correctional officer. So each correctional officer can only supervise so many death row inmates. So that costs more. The security for death row is more. The mental, psychological effects on inmates on death row is more significant. So they have to watch for those concerns. And the other thing is that inmates have a substantial amount of appealing. And so by the time it works all the way through the appeals process, it generally costs 2 times more than it would have been just to keep them in prison for the rest of their lives. So if you're just going from a cost benefit analysis, then it is not necessarily a smart thing to have the death penalty because it costs a lot more money. And then this is one we already talked about. We said we have this human rights or International Declaration of Human Rights, and many people argue that it violates those human rights. It's a human rights abuse. And they link it back to World War II and the concentration camps. And so they do not believe that it should be allowed at all because it's a violation of our basic human rights. One of the bigger issues that's come to light in recent years is the execution of innocent people. And people used to say all the time, oh, it doesn't happen. You never execute an innocent person. And then there's been some really strong cases that have shown that that has possibly happened in this country. So what has happened is there's some people in jail and they've had people advocate for them. And there's a group of people called the Innocence Project, and they spend their time trying to reevaluate court cases and exonerate people that have been convicted if there's enough evidence to show that they didn't really do it. So if something went wrong along the legal process and an innocent person got put in jail, the Innocence Project is there to try to help prove that the person didn't do it and get them out of jail. Well, what happens if they didn't do it and you've already executed them? So this has been a huge concern. So that's why the states that have the moratorium, a lot of them have put that into place because no governor ever wants to be the governor that allows the execution of an innocent person. We do know that since 1973, 173 people on death row have been let go because they were wrongfully convicted. We'll never know probably exactly how many were executed that were innocent, but even being on death row is pretty significant because you're pretty close to it being carried out. So this is a huge concern, and this seems to be one of the stronger arguments in recent years of why that the death penalty should no longer exist. Now, it's a issue that has clearly 2 sides. People feel definitely passionate one side or the other. So there are many arguments for why people believe we should have the death penalty. So one of them is retribution, simply revenge. You took somebody's life. And if you think about it as a family member, if somebody took one of your family members' life, you would want them to pay. And you probably don't want them living anymore either. They took your loved one away, so they should have to pay for what happened to your loved one. So this is often also referred to as just desserts. You got what you deserved because you did a horrible, awful, terrible crime. Okay? So that is a pretty strong argument, at least an emotional argument, of why maybe we should have the death penalty. Oh, I keep doing that. Click on the pictures. Okay. Another thing is for protection. So we talked about incapacitation. Incapacitation is keeping the person from being able to ever commit another crime. So some people passionately believe in the death penalty because they believe that if you execute them, then you can protect society from ever this person doing an evil act again, right? So you say, well, they're in prison for life. They couldn't anyway. Well, they could. Sometimes they get out. Sometimes they could kill a correctional officer in there. They could kill another inmate. So the only way to truly protect society is to take them out of it through the use of the death penalty. Other people still argue that it's deterrent, that you can keep other people from committing heinous crimes because they won't want the death penalty. So that is still an argument that exists. And then other people think that it gives the victim some peace. if you know that the person, your loved one's never coming back, but to think that the person that killed him is still out there in the world, sometimes it's hard for the victims' families to move on. So many argue that it just gives the victims peace if they know that the person is no longer on the earth. Okay, so we already talked about this moratorium movement. This seemed to have been a movement that gained a lot of sway in like the last 10 years because of exonerated innocent people. So you do see some states still in that moratorium stage. So the last thing is, what is the future of the death penalty? So 65% of people still support it, but every year that number declines. So you could see the number of executions declining, and a lot of that can be attributed to the fact that less and less people every year really believe in or want the death penalty. When surveyed, most people, 50%, at least half people would prefer life without parole over death penalty. So not cutting them any slack, they still are going to have to spend the rest of their life in prison, but not use the death penalty. In 2008, the Supreme Court did uphold lethal injection at that point and said that it was okay. That was under a standard set of 3 drugs that the Supreme Court said did not cause torture or lingering death. Since those companies have stopped manufacturing those or using those or selling those drugs to different states, they have gone to different drugs, and there's been a lot of cases of botched executions out there based on the new drugs. So I think this issue may be revisited at some point in the future. In fact, I just read an article recently about an execution, I forget what state it was, maybe Louisiana, where it was extremely botched. And the commentary of people in that state were, well, this would be a perfect case to take to the Supreme Court because of the torture and lingering death that the person suffered. And a lot of people have reaffirmed that they don't want the death penalty in the 2016 election when it became a significant issue in that election. It hasn't really been a significant issue since then, but it is an issue. Now, when Donald Trump, so a lot of presidents have put a moratorium on federal executions. Donald Trump revoked that and actually accelerated the amount of federal executions that were existing. And it was really a significant issue at the very end of his presidency. They were executing quite a few people. So you can see there's articles about that. When Biden became president, he reinstated the moratorium at the federal level. Now, he can't control what states do, but right now there's not going to be any federal executions. So that's kind of where we stand right now. So I want to know how you feel. Are you for or against the death penalty? So use some of the arguments and the information and the court cases and all of the things that are in this lecture and participate in the Chapter 9 discussion. Tell me your feelings on the death penalty. Obviously, keep it professional, but you can and use information for support. So it's an academic opinion, but you can state your opinion. Okay? So that's the end of the death penalty lecture. I hope you enjoyed it. And so next week, so we are done with courts now. This is the last lecture for the court system. So you are now ready to take exam number 3, which is on just the court system. So make sure you review chapter 7, 8, and 9 and have all your information, and then you're ready. And then next week, we move into corrections and we start talking about corrections. So I will see you soon.